Good morning. So this morning we are going to review chapter 24 and move into chapter 25. The last chapter 24, 25, and then getting into chapter 26 can seem a little bit repetitive. In chapter 24 we were dealing with Felix. Chapter 25 today we're going to be talking about Festus. And then we're going to get into a little bit with King Agrippa today, and then he'll be the focus of next week, chapter 26. 24, 25, 26. Those three chapters. We get three different characters. We've got governors, we've got kings, so we've got relationships between these different individuals that are leaders in Judea and in the region. So some of it is a little bit repetitive with the theme of what it is that Paul has been accused of. But we're going to really focus today on the fact that Jesus reminds his disciples that his followers will be brought to give an account, to be witnesses of him, and sometimes even standing before kings, as Paul is going to today, King Agrippa. This morning I'd like to start with a hymn from the mission section of the hymnal. This is one that's not very familiar. The fellow that wrote this, Karl Bogacki, was a Polish hymn writer, so he was raised in Poland, but wrote in German. And some of it takes us back to Pentecost and the outpouring of the Holy Spirit, and the reminder that it is through the work of the Holy Spirit that his people then do bear witness, just as Paul is going to in these chapters, and as we have the opportunity to as well. So we begin with prayer. Awake, thou Spirit, who didst fire the watchmen of the church's youth, who faced the foe's envenomed ire, who witnessed day and night thy truth, whose voices loud are ringing still, and bringing hosts to know thy will. Lord, let our earnest prayer be heard, the prayer thy Son hath bid us pray. For lo, thy children's hearts are stirred in every land in this our day, to cry with fervent soul to thee, O help us, Lord, so let it be. O haste to help ere we are lost. Send preachers forth in spirit strong, armed with thy word a dauntless host, bold to attack the rule of wrong. Let them the earth for thee reclaim, thy heritage to know thy name. And let thy word have speedy course, through every land be glorified, till all the heathen know its force, and fill thy churches far and wide. O spread the conquest of thy word, and let thy kingdom come, dear Lord. Amen. All right, chapter 24, the review of that chapter, the questions that we have on the back of the chapter 24 worksheet. Question number 1, who came to Caesarea for Paul's trial? There are 3 answers for this one.
Ananias.
So Ananias, who was Ananias? The high priest. That's one.
The elders.
The elders. Tertullus. Well, who was Tertullus?
A lawyer.
He was a lawyer. So he was representing the Jews before Felix. Number 2, how does Tertullus begin his speech to Felix? Yeah, okay, so he's trying to butter him up, isn't he? He's trying to make him look good, even though he didn't have many good qualities to emphasize. So he's lying a little bit along the way in order to represent, or at least to get his goodwill. Number 3, what are the charges that are brought against Paul by the Jews? What's the first one?
Troublemaker.
Okay, so he's a troublemaker. Some of the translations use a little bit of a different word, but what's that?
Plague.
Okay, he's a plague, and
Dissension.
yeah, so he's stirring up dissension among the Jews. So the troublemaker, the idea of a plague, this is bad for our society. How is he doing that? By stirring dissension among the Jews, and then he says throughout the entire world. So not just here, but throughout the entire world. How about 2? Second accusation.
Stirring up riots as well.
Well, that would have been the one that, those are kind of connected. He is a plague or a troublemaker by stirring up dissension.
Ringleader of the Nazarene.
Okay, so number 2 is he's a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. So remember, this is the whole idea here is that He was a propagator of an illegal religion among the Romans. So he is a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes, was argument number 2. What was the third accusation?
Profane the temple.
All right, so he was going to desecrate, or he tried, the word there is, he tried to desecrate the temple. So those are the 3 arguments, in essence, that are laid out by Tertullus. And then what does he have to say about Lysias, the Roman commander?
He took Paul out of their hands.
Yeah, and how? Violently. So we had things under control until Lysias came down and he violently took Paul out of our charge. So again, there's this idea that you Romans shouldn't have stepped in. We had things under control, was the argument that Tertullus was making. Number 5, who verified the charges he had made?
The Jews.
The Jews. Okay. But remember, they said, yeah, it's all true, but they didn't have any proof. They didn't have any witnesses for all of this, even though there were these people that were saying, yeah, it's true. Number 6, what does Paul say about the charges made by the Jews? We have 2 blanks here.
He didn't argue with anyone at the temple.
Okay, so he did not come, he was not having a debate or even a discussion with anybody at the temple. He did not cause any riots. That was number 1. What was the second argument that Paul made? This is an important one. Leanne, I think, touched on this.
They couldn't prove the charges.
Yeah, they have no evidence. There's no one to prove the things that they are saying. So I came to worship, to bring this offering. He's going to get into that later on in some of the following verses. I had no discussions with people. All of this was started by other people, which we're going to get into in one of the next questions coming down. Number 7, how does Paul use this as an opportunity to profess his faith in Jesus?
He's a follower of the Christian.
Yeah, he says, okay, I am a follower of, what did he call it? What was the phrase?
The way.
The way. So again, he doesn't mention the name of Jesus right here, but he says, I am a follower of the way. And we're going to get into that with some of the future questions too. Number 8, how does he present the Christian faith? When he talks about this religion of the way, how is it presented to Felix?
Is that where it comes in, believers of the prophet?
Yes. So he's saying that Christianity, or those who are followers of the way, are actually the proper descendants of the Old Testament religion. They're the proper adherents to the religion of the Old Testament. So it's not the Christian religion that's illegal. If you're going to look at it, that's the charge that's going to be made, because they are the proper followers of what was foretold by the prophets in the Old Testament. Good. Number 9, what does Paul say was the cause of the commotion in Jerusalem?
Brought a Greek into the temple, and he was accused.
Correct. Maybe this would be better if it was who does Paul say?
The Jews from Asia.
The Jews from Asia. They were the ones who made the assumption that Kayla was talking about, that he had brought Trophimus into the temple. But the ones who actually stirred up the riot were those Jews who had followed him from Asia, recognized him, and made an assumption about what he had done in the temple. Good. Number 10, what does Felix decide to do with the case?
Adjourn the meeting?
Yes.
He puts it off.
Yeah, he puts it off. He postpones it. He said, okay, and until when?
Wait for Lysias' testimony.
Okay, so we're going to postpone this for now. We'll wait for Lysias to come from Jerusalem in order to hear what he has to say. So there's he wants to put this off if he can. Number 11, what kind of accommodations did Paul have?
Gives him liberty and allows him to have visitors.
Okay, so he is in custody, but he's sort of like house arrest. So he has freedom for people to come and go. He can have discussions with people. So there was a certain amount of freedom in his custody. What does that imply?
He's not guilty.
Yeah, it implies that Felix knows that he's not guilty. Otherwise, he wouldn't have granted him that freedom. So again, that tells us something along the way. 12, what was Felix hoping for? A bribe. And do you remember why we talked a little bit about the possibility of why he was hoping for a bribe?
Because he came to Jerusalem with money.
Yeah, because Paul mentioned the fact that he had come to bring this offering for the poor in Jerusalem. So it's possible that Felix thought, oh, this guy's got wealthy backers. And so they're going to want to spring him. All I have to do is wait until he gets tired of sitting around, and then they'll and that was very common in those days. It's common today too. Seriously, especially if you're in third world countries and places. I can't tell you all of the times when I was in Africa serving as a part-time missionary where people were expecting a bribe. Crossing borders, all kinds of things like that. And I just told them, nope. There was one time I thought I was going to get left behind at the Uganda border because I wasn't going to pay the bribe. And so they expect it, but I told them, I said, you have no authority to hold me here. I'm going to go. So they didn't push it. 13, how long was Paul in prison?
2 years.
2 years. All right, so that gives us a little bit of an idea of how long this has gone on. Imagine sitting in prison. Now, it is house arrest, so it's a little bit easier than being in a jail cell. But still 2 years. Imagine how frustrating that would be for Paul as he was sitting there waiting. Felix kept bringing him out, saying, hey, I want to hear you again, but only to give him the opportunity to pay him the bribe. And so, again, as we see things moving forward now with Festus, you kind of have to keep in mind, Paul's been sitting there for 2 years waiting to be released, knowing that he was innocent, knowing that his captor knew that he was innocent, but still sitting and waiting.
Do you think he knew that he wanted to try? Do you think Paul?
Oh, just from experience, I'd say yes. Generally, people that want a bribe make it pretty clear that they're expecting a bribe. And they don't call it that, but they'll say, if you, sometimes they actually call it a fee. They'll say, if you give me the fee that you're required to give me, then I'll let you go. So sometimes they twist it because they don't want to get caught. Sometimes in certain countries it's sort of expected that you're going to ask for a bribe, but they know it. It's, they're greedy, and that's the way that they make a little bit of extra money. So my guess is that Paul, yes, he understood that he was expecting a bribe, but he wasn't going to give it to him. All right, any thoughts on chapter 24? So chapter 25, we're going to be introduced to a new governor. Felix was, at the very end of chapter 24, Felix was recalled to Rome for inability to perform his duties. So that didn't go well for him. And they replaced Felix with a new governor whose name is Festus. We were introduced to them at the end of chapter 24. So if you look back to verse 27, chapter 24, after 2 years had passed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus. And wishing to do the Jews a favor, Felix left Paul imprisoned. So he did not, at the end of his term, before he was done, let Paul go and get that thing done with. He wanted to do the Jews a favor, so he left him in prison. So we're picking it up with Festus now. Festus is taking over. And as he begins his role as governor, he's going to make a journey to Jerusalem. He's going to visit what is a very difficult place to rule. And he probably heard that from his predecessors. Make sure that things are going well in Jerusalem. If things are going well in Jerusalem, you're going to be just fine. So he spends at least a week in Jerusalem. And then we're going to be introduced to Herod Agrippa II. So he's not called that in our text, but we'll get into the Herodian chart in just a little bit. Herod Agrippa II is the one who is king at this time. And he comes up, so he's sort of under the governor, so he's called king, and we would think king would be above a governor, right? But it's the other way around in this order. The governor had a large territory. A king was underneath him in a smaller territory. So King Agrippa was in charge of Jerusalem and part of Judea underneath Festus. So these two guys are going to have to work together. And it's going to be important that Agrippa comes up and meets Festus, and they iron out some details and say, okay, let's make sure that we're on the same page. So that's where Agrippa is going to come in connection with the introduction to Paul. Yes?
I'm just curious, is one a Roman officer and the other a Jewish king, or is that not a Jewish king?
No. Yes and no. They were both Roman offices. But the Herodians, all right, you forced me to do it. I was planning to do it. So this is the Herodian family tree, and it is an ugly family tree, but it is helpful to understand the history here. So at the top, actually, we should probably go back one more generation. So Herod the Great is probably the most familiar of all of the Herodian kings. Now, the Herodians were Edomites. Who were the Edomites?
Descendants of Esau.
Descendants of Esau. Okay, so when Jacob and Esau are born, and we have the prophecies that God gives to their mother about them, it talks about Esau breaking off the bonds of his brother. So generally the Edomites were under the rule of the people of Judah, the children of Israel. But in this time frame, you have the Edomites, for the last time, ruling over the children of Israel. So Herod the Great, he was a mess. He was a very smart individual. He's the one who built the temple that Jesus would have walked in. He was the one who built Caesarea Maritima, where Paul would be staying right now. He named it after Caesar in order to, again, butter things up with that king. He was also the king who did kill all of the babies in Bethlehem and tried to kill Jesus. So this Herod, he had 8 wives. And a lot of those were political related. So he would marry somebody in order to solidify political boundaries and things like that. And again, that was very important for him. So you have some of the wives that are listed here, and then some of their children. And not all of the children became famous, but a lot of them do. So you have Herod the Great, who tried to kill Jesus. And then you have a bunch of, so these are his wives in the brownish reddish that are listed there. And you have the descendants. So again, I'm not going to go through all of these, but a lot of these descendants play a very important role in biblical history. So all the way over on the right-hand side, you have Philip the Tetrarch. He's mentioned in Scripture because he was the one who was the father of Salome, who requested the head of John the Baptist. But his wife, Herodias, left him and married, that would be Herod Philip. It is a very complicated family tree. Similar names. So Herod Philip is the one who was the father of Salome. Salome had a relationship with her uncle, Philip the Tetrarch. Again, really messy.
Question?
Yes.
For number 3, Herodias, is
Yep.
that a lady?
Yes, Herodias is a woman. Yep. And she took on the name. You get the Herod name connected with it also. So she was a daughter. So you see the connection here? So she was she would have been a granddaughter of Herod the Great through daughter of Herod the Great through Mariamne. And then she married what would have been her cousin, and then had a relationship with another cousin. And so I wanted to focus on the ones that are really important. So Herodias, and then Herod Antipas is the one who had John the Baptist beheaded. Okay, so there's another Herod who was involved in trying to slow down the work of the gospel. And then we get down to the next generation in the blues, and these are the ones that we've been talking about more recently. So before we had Drusilla. At the very middle of it, Drusilla was married to Felix, who was the previous governor in Judea and the area, and was exiled or taken back to Rome. Okay, so that would be a sister to the one that we're talking about now. Herod Agrippa II is the son of Herod Agrippa I, and Herod Agrippa I was the one who had James put to death and who had imprisoned Peter and was going to put Peter to death, except for that angel brought him out of the prison. So remember when we discussed that in Acts? So that was his father. So he comes from a long line of individuals who are opposed to the message of the gospel. Now, we don't hear anything specifically bad about this Herod Agrippa II in the scriptures themselves, but just know that he comes from a long line of individuals who are pretty messed up, who are very power hungry. Herod the Great, I was going to talk about him. Herod the Great, he had these 8 wives. He killed many of his own children, because he was afraid that they were going to take his power. Actually, some of them were plotting against their father to kill him, and he found out and had them killed at first. And then he exiled some of his wives to other places because they were involved in the plots against him. So again, very, very complicated family tree because of all of the intermarriage and the relationships between all of them. And I just kind of wanted to focus down here on the end of Herod Agrippa II because he's the one that we're talking about in this text. So he's the one that's going to come up when we get to the second half of chapter 25 and then into chapter 26. Now, knowing this, we were told that Drusilla was a Jewish, so we have some history behind some of these, that these individuals are at least going to be familiar. So Luke had told us that Drusilla was familiar with the way, and that her husband Felix was familiar with the way because of her relationship with the Jews. And the same thing is true with Agrippa and his sister. And notice there's a question mark as to whether or not they had an affair of some kind together. Also, the text tells us that it was his sister that was there, but history tells us that they might have had a relationship also. So again, just very, very complicated family history. And we have bits and pieces of this family throughout biblical history as well. So, yes?
Okay. So Drusilla was a Jew, right?
She was Jewish, right.
Okay.
She was a Jewess. So possibly through her, we don't have the mother in all of this, but possibly through the mother that so her father would have been, again, of Edomite lineage, but her mother...
Oh, that way, okay.
Correct. Okay? Makes perfect sense, right? You got it all now. So you'll be ready for your test next week. All right, so chapter 25, we're going to back up to Festus. So Festus, we're going to have in this chapter Paul appealing his case. So Felix has held him for 2 years. Festus is going to go and introduce himself to the people in Judea. And again, they're going to say, hey, what about Paul? They're going to bring it up right away. They're going to exert their authority and say, hey, you got this guy in jail up there. We want him prosecuted. So they're going to try to get that going right away. And we'll see his political nature come out and how he's very careful in what he says and how he says it as he deals with their accusations. So chapter 25, verse 1, is there a volunteer to read the first 12 verses?
3 days after arriving in the province, Festus went up from Caesarea to Jerusalem, where the chief priests and Jewish leaders appeared before him and presented the charges against Paul. They urgently requested Festus as a favor to them to have Paul transferred to Jerusalem, for they were preparing an ambush to kill him along the way. Festus answered, Paul is being held at Caesarea, and I myself am going there soon. Let some of your leaders come with me and press charges against the man there, if he has done anything wrong. After spending 8 or 10 days with them, he went down to Caesarea, and the next day he convened the court and ordered that Paul be brought before him. When Paul appeared, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him, bringing many serious charges against him, which they could not prove. Then Paul made his defense. I have done nothing wrong against the law of the Jews or against the temple or against Caesar. Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, said to Paul, Are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and stand trial before me there on these charges? Paul answered, I am now standing before Caesar's court, where I ought to be tried. I have not done any wrong to the Jews, as you yourself know very well. If, however, I am guilty of doing anything deserving death, I do not refuse to die. But if the charges brought against me by these Jews are not true, no one has the right to hand me over to them. I appeal to Caesar. After Festus had conferred with his council, he declared, You have appealed to Caesar you will go.
All right, so at the very beginning here, you have Festus. He comes to Jerusalem. He's going to meet with the people there, get to introduce himself, etc. First thing that comes up, as far as Luke tells us, is the situation with Paul. Now, we had talked about this a couple of chapters ago. The last time that there was a plot against the Apostle Paul, we can't actually say that it had to do with the Jewish leaders because the text doesn't tell us that. This time it does. This time it says that the Jewish leaders were involved in the plot against Paul. And again, they tried the same thing that was tried several chapters earlier. Let's have him brought down to Jerusalem so that we can ambush him with the intent, Luke tells us, to kill him. So they wanted to take matters into their own hands. And the implication here with Luke in this chapter is that this was the leading men of the Jews and the chief priests. So this would have been the religious leaders in this case that were involved in this. So this is 2 years later. 2 years later, and they have their sights set on the Apostle Paul. So their request is to have Paul brought to Jerusalem. They can't carry out the plot unless he's transported back down to Jerusalem. Now, it's possible that Festus knows all of this. He's heard this from Felix. And so he's going to be very careful. He says, I'm not going to bring him down to you guys. You guys come up to Caesarea. He says, I'll be back up there in a few days. You come up there and bring your charges against him there. So that's the plan. He makes it back to Caesarea. He sets up a day. The Jews come up in order to charge Paul with whatever it is that they want to accuse him of. And we don't get the details in chapter 25 that we've had in previous chapters. But what are we told? What does Luke tell us about the charges that are brought against Paul?
They're not true.
Okay, they're unfounded. You can't prove them. Now, Paul gives us some insight as to what the charges are. And that's in verse 8. What are the three categories? He's defending himself.
The law of the Jews,
Okay.
against the temple, or a Caesar.
Okay, so these are the same things we've talked about in the last couple of chapters. So the charges haven't changed based on what Paul is saying now. He says, I've done nothing against the law of the Jews. I have done nothing to profane the temple. And I have said nothing to undermine Caesar. So the charges haven't changed again in 2 years. And he's saying, again, there's no evidence, there's no proof for anything. I've done nothing for which I have been charged. But then we're told in verse 9, nothing changes. Festus, wanting to do the Jews a favor. How many times have we heard that about Roman governors? Right? Back up to chapter 24, 27. Felix wanted to do the Jews a favor. Can you think of another governor that wanted to do the Jews a favor? Pontius Pilate, who wanted to make the Jews happy by giving them Jesus. So there's a common theme that's going on here in the Gospels when it comes to Roman governors. This was a trouble spot for the Romans, and they knew it. And there were a whole bunch of Roman governors that were pulled back to Rome. Pilate was, Felix was, Festus was concerned, hey, this is a bad pattern to be following in. He wanted to make this work also. But it was actually by trying to make the Jews happy that things got worse, because what happens? You try to make people happy, they're just going to want more and more and more and more. And you're never actually going to make them happy. They're just going to realize they can manipulate you and get what they want. It's kind of like kids. Except for it doesn't stay with kids, does it? It grows into adults. When you train an individual, that's what they get. They're going to become that as an adult also, where they get what they want, and they push buttons until they get what they want. So Festus, wanting to do the Jews a favor, asked Paul, hey, would you be willing to go down to Jerusalem and stand trial? Now think about this from Paul's perspective for just a minute. What has Paul come to the realization of at this point?
He's kind of in charge.
Okay.
I mean, he's kind of controlling his own destiny.
In a sense, right. What has he learned about Festus? Does Festus have his best interests in mind? No. He's come to that conclusion very quickly, hasn't he? And if Festus doesn't have his best interests in mind in Caesarea, is Festus going to have his best interests in mind in Jerusalem?
No.
Not a chance. Are things going to be better for Paul in Jerusalem or Caesarea? Caesarea. He knows it's going to be bad news to go back to Jerusalem. He's seen what has happened. Remember, he was beaten several times while he was in Jerusalem. He says this is not a good thing. He's already seen that Festus is willing to be molded by the Jews. And the pressure is only going to get worse in Jerusalem as opposed to being in Caesarea. He says, I'm not going to Jerusalem. So Paul then responds and says, hey, if I have done something wrong, I should be prosecuted and I should be punished. But if I'm innocent, then whatever you're doing, you shouldn't be doing. And so he says, I realize I'm not going to get a fair trial here. I've been waiting for 2 years. And so he says, I appeal to Caesar. Now, this was the right of every Roman citizen. We see the Roman citizenship coming up again. Not any person could appeal for this, but Roman citizens could. So again, we've seen Paul, he has been beaten even though he shouldn't have been beaten. We've seen times where he was going to be beaten and they found out that he was a Roman citizen and didn't beat him. This is a time where he was able to now appeal to Caesar and say, hey, I'm going to go all the way up the ladder and I'm going to go to the highest court in the land and I'm going to have him hear my court. Now, there might have been a little bit more of a rationale behind this. If you remember 2 years earlier when Paul was first arrested, the Lord had told him, you are going to go to Rome. Now, he's been waiting for 2 years. But think about this for just a minute, that one of the charges that has been brought against Paul has to do with whether or not Christianity is a legal religion, right? If he appeals to Caesar and has Caesar hear his case, and Caesar says this is a lawful religion, imagine the implications of that for the spread of the gospel and throughout the Roman Empire. So Paul may have also been thinking about what Jesus had already told him in that promise 2 years earlier, that you're going to be going to Rome, and having that in the back of his mind when he appealed, knowing that the Lord, remember the Lord has also said, I'm going to be with you and you are going to represent me, you are going to be my witness to Rome, that Paul may have thought, this is an opportunity for my fellow Christians, since this is an accusation that's been brought against Christianity. You think that's going to go away? No, not until Caesar steps in and says, yes, this is a legal religion. Now, do you have any idea who the Roman emperor, who Caesar was at this point? Probably one of the most famous.
Alexander the Great.
He was Greek.
I tried.
Yes, he very, very famous. Very, very famous. Yes, probably the most famous individual in history. Nero. Why do we know Nero?
Oh, he was not good.
That's right. He was not good. Do you remember what he did? He burned Rome to the ground and blamed the Christians for it. So this was not a good guy. Now, he wasn't, Paul, when he appealed to Caesar, that didn't necessarily mean he was going to stand before Caesar. It meant Caesar's court. But still, it's going to be Nero who's going to put Paul to death, ultimately. Now, he's going to be found innocent when we get to chapter 28. I think we don't quite, the book of Acts doesn't actually tell us the end of of Paul's life. But he does stand before Caesar. He is exonerated. He's set free. He is captured again later on, and he is put to death by Nero. At this point, Nero wasn't as crazy as he would become later on. And there's a lot of historical records that believe that Nero literally lost his mind through some of the things that were going on. So yeah, Nero's the one who's Caesar at this point. He ruled for about 12 years, if I remember correctly, and it would have been at the beginning part of Nero's reign. All right, so Festus then consults with his council and says, okay, he's appealed to Caesar. There's nothing else we can do. So he says, to Caesar then you are going to go. Now verse 13, we are introduced to King Agrippa. This is a few days later. Within a matter of weeks, King Agrippa wants to come and meet with Festus. And Festus is going to say, hey, I've got a problem here. This guy's appealed to Caesar, but I need to have an accusation to send along when I send it to Caesar, and I don't know what to put down. I don't know what this guy's guilty of. What am I going to say to Caesar? So he's looking for help from King Agrippa, who again, at least has a Jewish connection that Festus does not. He's going to understand the Jews better than Festus does. And so he's looking for some help. He says, I want you to hear this case, and I want you to help me write something up that I can send to Caesar explaining what's going on here. So verse 13, another volunteer to read for us, verse 13. Go ahead, Sandy.
How far do you want?
Let's take it to the end, if you don't mind.
Now, when several days had elapsed, King Agrippa and Bernice arrived at Caesarea and paid their respects to Festus. And while they were spending many days there, Festus laid Paul's case before the king, saying, there is a certain man left a prisoner by Felix. And when I was at Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews brought charges against him, asking for a sentence of condemnation upon him. And I answered them that it is not the custom of the Romans to hand over any man before the accused meets his accusers face to face and has an opportunity to make his defense against the charges. And so after they had assembled here, I made no delay, but on the next day took my seat on the tribunal and ordered the man to be brought. And when the accusers stood up, they began bringing charges against him, not of such crimes as I was expecting, but they simply had some points of disagreement with him about their own religion and about a certain dead man, Jesus, whom Paul asserted to be alive. And being at a loss how to investigate such matters, I asked whether he was willing to go to Jerusalem and there stand trial on these matters. But when Paul appealed to be held in custody for the emperor's decision, I ordered him to be kept in custody until I send him to Caesar. And Agrippa said to Festus, I also would like to hear the man myself. Tomorrow, he said, you shall hear him. And so on the next day, when Agrippa had come together with Bernice amid great pomp, and had entered the auditorium accompanied by the commanders and the prominent men of the city, at the command of Festus, Paul was brought in. And Festus said, King Agrippa, and all you gentlemen here present with us, you behold this man about whom all the people of the Jews appealed to me, both at Jerusalem and here, loudly declaring that he ought not to live any longer. But I found that he had committed nothing worthy of death, and since he himself appealed to the emperor, I decided to send him. Yet I have nothing definite about him to write to my lord. Therefore I have brought him before you all, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that after the investigation has taken place, I may have something to write. For it seems absurd to me in sending a prisoner not to indicate also the charges against him.
All right, so there's Festus's overview of the situation to King Agrippa and the help that he's looking for. He basically describes what has happened over the last, he goes back even a little bit before that, but what did you notice that Festus said to King Agrippa about his view of Paul? Did you notice?
He was in it?
Yeah, he admits to Agrippa and before this group, whoever this group is, that he has found nothing that is worthy of death in him, just like Pilate did. And he's also pointed out that the Jews want him put to death. He's mentioned that twice in this section, that when they look at what it is that they've accused him of, he is worthy of death. Twice they have brought that up, that he needs to die for what he has done. He says, I just see this as a religious dispute. This is a matter of their religion. And did you also notice what specifically he pointed to? What did he catch on about? He's already had enough information from Paul to recognize something very important about the dispute. What is the dispute about? The religious dispute between Jesus and the Jews.
They need to specify the charges.
Yes.
About a man who he claimed had died but is living.
Yes, so that's very, very interesting. So he's learned enough about this disagreement between Paul and the Jews to understand this is about the resurrection of Jesus. How many times have we heard that said in the book of Acts? I am on trial today for the resurrection of the dead, Paul has said. Not only ours, but also the resurrection of Jesus. And he says, this is what this is all about. Now, I thought it was kind of interesting because he says at the end there, verse 20, being at a loss how to investigate such matters. Okay, if this is a matter about a guy that died and is said to be alive, you'd think that that would be a fairly easy thing to figure out. Now, maybe he's unfamiliar with Jewish burial practices, but as somebody who's in charge of this, you'd think that you could send some people in to say, okay, let's find out about this Jesus guy who was put to death. Is he still dead or not? And then you'd think that if he did a little bit of investigation, what would he find out? What do you think is the first thing he's going to find out if he sent some guys to do some investigation about the resurrection of Jesus from the dead? That's probably not the first thing he's going to find out. Who's he going to talk to first, most likely?
The Jews?
The Jews. And what are the Jews going to say? That he died, and?
The disciples told him.
And the disciples stole his body away. Remember, the soldiers were bribed? That's the story that's going to be told. But again, if you dig a little bit deeper, then the question is, okay, well, where did the body go? Yes, they might have stolen the body away, but where did they put it? Has anybody looked into this? So again, from a legal perspective, he says, well, I don't even know where to start. This seems like a pretty easy place to start. There's a missing body, or maybe not a missing body. There's a body. Let's see if we can find the body. Let's start with that. And if we can't find the body, then we try to find out what happened to the body. There are more difficult cases to solve than this one. And so he says, I just don't know what to do with this particular case. And so he says, that's what I'm asking you about, King Agrippa. He said, you should know about this kind of stuff. So Agrippa is eager to hear about Jesus. He probably is, again, familiar with some of the things that have taken place, just like others have been. And it'll be interesting as we get into chapter 26 to hear Paul now as he gives his defense to Agrippa, knowing that Agrippa has at least a familiarity with the issues within Judaism, the distinctions between the Pharisees and the Sadducees and Christianity. And so this is going to be a neat chapter, because in chapter 25, we had one quote from Paul. That was it. He says, this is what I'm being charged, these three things, and these things aren't true. But we're going to get a nice sermon in chapter 26 where Paul highlights the gospel, what Christianity is all about, as he tries to show Agrippa and to witness to Agrippa and say, this is what I believe, this is why I believe it, this is why you should believe it too. So this will be a pretty neat chapter. 26 is a very powerful one as Paul gives his actual defense before Agrippa and also Festus. So any questions, thoughts on chapter 25? This is a little bit more...
I just looked at the timeline, and you mentioned the aspect of, they had this huge problem about the resurrection, and that was the base of it. And I looked at it, I go, this is all happening 28 years
Correct.
After the resurrection of Jesus.
Correct.
It's like bringing up a cold case or something.
It is, yeah. That's a good point. So we've talked a little, 30 years, so you're talking about a generation. We've talked about how some of these individuals, like I think it was Dory mentioned Ananias at the very beginning. So Ananias was a new high priest. He wasn't around. Well, he might have been around, but he wasn't involved in the death of Jesus. So you're right. This is a whole new generation at this point. And yet, if you were to do a little bit of investigation, there's going to be certain information that's still going to be available. It is going to be more difficult because it's 30 years later. It's not like it was yesterday or a month ago or even 2 years ago. This is going to be a little bit more complicated in sorting through all of it. And maybe that's a little bit about what Festus was trying to point out. We don't know whether or not Paul gives an indication of how long ago this has taken place. Whether Festus knows it was 30 years ago or not, we don't know. But it was still going to be a little bit of a challenge. I think it was probably more on his part just not wanting, or maybe not caring, with some of these Roman leaders. It wasn't so much that they were excited about trying to find it. If you get a good cold case investigator, right, they're going to dig into it. They want to know the answer. I get the impression from Festus, he wasn't one of those guys. He's like, I'm not really all that interested in this. I want somebody else to do the work for me. But 30 years makes a difference. Yeah, that timeline that John is talking about, so if you haven't picked that up, that can be helpful. The timeline sheet that gives us a little bit of the years of where Paul is along the way, and that sheet's over there too. Helpful to have a little bit of a background information so you can kind of put everything in its chronological perspective. And as John mentioned, it gives you an idea, perspective. Oh, this was almost 30 years ago that this took place. So we read through the book of Acts in a year, or 8 months, and so it seems like it's all closer together than that. But we've covered 30 years since we started. We've covered 30 years since we started the book of Acts. It's like time traveling. So we've covered a lot of ground over the course of this study in the book of Acts. A little bit different than what you have in the Gospels. You know, the Gospels cover about 30 years too, just a little bit more than that. But the majority of the Gospels are covering 3 years. And a large portion of the Gospels cover 1 week. So 1/4, almost a third of the 4 Gospels record the events of 8 days, from Palm Sunday to Easter. So it's pretty incredible to think about how quickly we can go through that short time frame. And so time flies as you're reading through these things. Did somebody else have a comment? I thought I saw another hand.
Where's this timeline?
It should be on the shelf. I'll grab one for you after we're done. I've got one over there. If anybody else needs one, let me know. All right, so next week we're up for chapter 26 then. We'll get Paul's defense before Herod Agrippa and his sister Bernice. Let's close with the benediction. In the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, the love of God and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with you now and always. Amen.